Did greed and corruption lead to the latest corporate scandals in the United States? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Corporate greed and corruption were thought to be largely in the past following the recession of 2008. But recent headlines about Wells Fargo Bank and Mylan, the drug maker of EpiPen, a life-saving medication, have cast a new shadow over corporate America. More than 5,000 Wells Fargo employees were fired for creating fake accounts, while Mylan raised the price of its emergency allergy medication by 600%. Since acquiring it just 9 years ago. Later, we'll go in depth with our panel, but we begin with this report from CCTV's Jessica Stone.
Wells Fargo Bank has learned firsthand that the words scandal and bank don't mix. It is no longer the world's most valuable bank. Over the past 5 years, the company set unrealistic sales goals, which led to widespread fraud. The bank was slapped with a $185 million fine, but never admitted wrongdoing for creating as many as 2 million fake bank and credit card accounts.
I am deeply sorry that we failed to fulfill on our responsibility to our customers.
Mr. Strumpf, as you know,
at U.S. congressional hearings, one Massachusetts lawmaker channeled public outrage.
You haven't returned a single nickel of your personal earnings. You haven't fired a single senior executive. Instead, evidently, your definition of accountable is to push the blame to your low-level employees who don't have the money for a fancy PR firm to defend themselves. It's gutless leadership.
Just 2 days later, anger spilled over again after a major pharmaceutical company was discovered overcharging for critical medicine.
I wish we had better anticipated the magnitude and acceleration of the rising financial issues for a growing minority of patients.
Lawmakers pointed out the CEO's pay grew along with the drug prices.
Ms. Rest received $2.45 million according to financial report. Not bad.
In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, the U.S. government passed new regulations to prevent corporate greed. But Joe Minerick of the Committee for Economic Development in Washington, D.C. cautions companies still have to incentivize customer-friendly behavior.
You need a system where the individual has to deal with the customer fairly to get the incentive pay.
Minerick also points out Wells Fargo has already lost billions in market value and customer trust. Perhaps a bigger penalty, he suggests, than fines.
When consumers and investors see and recognize that bad behavior, they are going to be the most powerful enforcers.
It all adds up to less public trust for institutions, from government to business. And it may be one reason why people are increasingly turning away from the political establishment towards populist candidates, not only here in the United States, but around the world. Anand?
Thanks, Jessica. That's CCTV's Jessica Stone reporting. Okay, let's get to our panel. Mark Hodak counsels corporations as the founder of Hodak Value Advisors. He joins us from Dallas. With us here in Washington is Bartlett Naylor. He's a financial policy advocate with the watchdog group Public Citizen. And Richard Bistrong is a writer, analyst, and commentator focusing on anti-bribery compliance. He heads his own consulting firm, Frontline Anti-Bribery, and joins us from New York. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Richard, we just heard of the cases of Wells Fargo and EpiPen, or Mylan, which is the company that owns EpiPen. Are these companies indicative of a corporate culture in America that emphasizes greed and profit over things like fair play, ethics, good business practice?
I don't know if it's greed and profit, but it's the question of how corporations are incentivizing their workforce. And, you know, we're not in a discussion about waging war on profits. Incentives are a proven indicator of performance. They've been around for years. In the case of Wells Fargo, you know, cross-selling is a proven sales practice. But the question is, how incentives are rolled out sends a very loud yet unspoken message to the workforce as to what does management really want. So my question is, we shouldn't have to incentivize people to behave ethically and to succeed, So the question is, what kind of message are the Wells Fargos, are the Milans delivering, where they're rolling out very aggressive targets, what some might even consider to be stretch goals?
Mark, you teach a class in the history of scandal. Let's look at the Wells Fargo case as one example. Here's a case that made headlines for a long time, where employees opened fake accounts to meet targets that were set by management. Did anyone break the law here?
Well, certainly some laws were broken. I'm not really a lawyer, so I don't know all the details on that. But I think the big problem was that even if they weren't breaking the law, there was a lot of unethical behavior. A lot of companies find their market values being pounded not because they necessarily broke the law, but because some of the behaviors that they indulged in ended up getting found out, and it hurt their reputations very badly. There's no question that opening up fake accounts, even if it was legal, is going to be something that was tolerated by the millions of customers that depend on Wells Fargo's bankers to act ethically and in their interest.
But when we look at the corporate system in the United States, in fact, if we look at the political system in the United States, is it lacking in oversight? Because it seems to start with the political system. We look at how presidents are elected, how congressmen are elected. They receive money in return for favors. That's corruption, isn't it?
Public citizens certainly believe so, that issue number one is the infection of money in politics. From Wells Fargo, and you can see the money that is flowing from Wells Fargo to the members of Congress. And it's the overt money that you can see publicized, but it's also the indirect money that is sort of laundered through institutions such as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The dirtier the company, the more likely it is they're funding the Chamber of Commerce, who will then come out with outrageous positions such as global warming doesn't exist, or the mega banks are your friend, and derivatives trading is really important to Sally's cupcake shop up at the corner and an uncleared margin and so forth. So money is sort of issue number one, and the problem is we've got a Congress, and we will have a president, one way or the other, who is basically put there from this money. So how can we expect them to fix the problem that put them there in the first place?
Is this a uniquely American thing, or would we find it in other parts of the world?
It is more European. European elected officials, their campaigns are short. They're not allowed in many cases, many Western countries, to accept money. Most Western European countries don't have the job title that I have, lobbyist. Now, they certainly have people that try to influence government, but they also go home and they sell pharmaceuticals in Switzerland. They have normal jobs as opposed to lobbying jobs. So yes, I think we, as relatively civilized countries go, we are at one edge of sanity when it comes to politics.
All right, Richard, you pleaded guilty to violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. What exactly did you plead guilty to, and do you believe that you were treated fairly? Because, you know, even if we look at the criminal justice system in the United States, it's not exactly fair, is it? It's a kind of system where you can plea your way out of it.
Well, this might be a counterintuitive answer, but I believe that the justice system is extremely fair. So I pled guilty to conspiring to bribe foreign officials in violation of the FCPA. Our judicial system allowed me the opportunity to plead guilty. I knew what I was doing was wrong. It was illegal and unethical. So the opportunity to respond to a government offer to come in and cooperate, which included 3 years of undercover law enforcement cooperation, and then face sentencing in federal court right there in D.C., to me gave everybody an opportunity to work together to potentially mitigate the consequences of my behavior, of my decisions. And the final chapter of that, after 5 years of cooperation, was 14 and a half months in federal prison. So I think, you know, I paid my price to society and justice was served. So from my perspective, the judicial process in this country is extremely fair.
Mark, we have situations in this country where a company like Wells Fargo can say, okay, we're going to pay the fines, we're going to make restitution to whichever party was injured, but we are not going to say that we were wrong. Is that fair?
I don't know, you know, about fair or not. I think that when you're talking about corporate behavior, it's very difficult to, you know, say a corporation has done something wrong, because it's individuals in the corporations that are making decisions, like Richard said, about the incentives and the constraints that they're under, and how they're going to treat their fellow employees or their customers. I think that really the biggest job of senior executives in corporations is the creation of a set of incentives and constraints for their employees that supports good behavior, profit-seeking behavior even, but in an ethical manner. And you know, you mentioned Mylan in the beginning. That was a situation where the senior executives had basically huge all-or-nothing bonuses attached to doubling their earnings in 5 years. If they would fall $1 short of that performance, they would get nothing. You know, what do you think people are going to do to get that last dollar? It's up to the board and to the senior management team to make sure that people are never in that position with poorly designed incentives. But other than that, you know, they do have a reason and a you know, a right to pursue business in a reasonable manner.
May I jump in? I'm happy to see a result of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I worked for Senator William Proxmire, chair of the Senate Banking Committee, who had much to do with the writing of the FCPA. I was the head of investigation for the Senate Banking Committee during a time when, for example, my team, if you will, put 1,000 savings and loan executives in jail, put Michael Milken in jail, which I think is itself an example of how deterrence, when it's applied to individuals, works. Milken was using his vast energies and intelligence for evil, undermining the junk bond market, indenturing major American companies, and now he's using those prodigious talents for great. He is quite the philanthropist, dealing with lots of various issues. The single biggest miscarriage of justice of the Obama administration is the failure to find, identify, indict, and imprison the people responsible for the worst financial crisis in basically a century. Instead, they've developed this concept of an immaculately conceived crime. We know there was a crime. We know that there were so many crimes committed at Wells Fargo, for example, in the last month. I lack the fingers and toes to count them. And yet the Justice Department, and this has been known since at least 2013, because that's when it was on the front page of the Los Angeles Times, the Justice Department has yet to comment on this case. We have to assume that they're investigating. So what we need is a Justice Department that actually finds individuals. You mentioned money at the outset. One has to be suspicious that the mega money coming from the mega banks into both parties, and it's coming into the Democrats as well, has to influence, or at least we have to be suspicious that it influences. And the simplest thing to do is basically find the bank and then just hope this all washes away and leave any individuals unaccountable.
Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Sorry. Well, I was just going to add on to that. That part of the challenge, and you know, Mark addressed this, and so did Bart, is, you know, some of these behaviors are, as compliance consultant Mike Scher recently wrote, they're lawful but awful. So some of these incentive practices, these business strategies, might be within the realm of legal behavior, but look at the unintended consequences on the commercial workforce and on society at large. But I think, pivoting on what Bart was sharing, I think the government shares some of that frustration and has drawn their own line in the sand, recently issuing what's called the Yates Memo, which talks about personal accountability, and that they are looking for the wrongdoers who committed these crimes and to seek out these wrongdoers. Even if a company comes in to cooperate and to talk about what happened, the Justice Department has said, be prepared to identify the wrongdoers. So I think that sort of frustration with who got charged at the financial meltdown, the Justice Department seems to have taken a turn on that.
And Richard, what about the interests of consumers in something like this? We know that a lot of consumers got hurt in the mortgage scandals of 2008, 2007. Their interests were not protected, were they?
Well, it seems like they were, in terms of the fine that Wells Fargo paid, and there will be restitution to the victims of those transactions. But on the other hand, what if we look at it more broadly? I mean, Wells Fargo had the brand of America's bank. They certainly would like to have continued consumer confidence, and I'm sure that's going to return, but we all want to have faith in our banking system and our bankers. So I think in a more macro perspective, consumer confidence in the bank system is hurt by something like this, and that doesn't benefit anyone.
I'll get to you in a moment, but I just want to go to Mark. Mark, when we look at this, what does this tell us about public confidence in corporate America, consumer confidence, and indeed in international confidence in the system here?
Well, there's no question that corporate behavior has shaken a lot of confidence in corporate America or corporations worldwide. And a lot of that is because I think corporations are much larger than they've ever been. We continually have consolidation, like we've got additional mergers being announced, huge mergers in the last couple of days. It's really hard to manage very, very large enterprises, whether you're talking about large corporations or governments. So it's easier, I think, these days for bad behavior to go hidden, and it's harder for corporations to manage their people. Every corporation is completely immersed in incentive formal, and they're not really paying as much attention, I think, to the impact of all those incentives that every one of their companies are subject to, as they could be if the companies weren't just so huge and sprawling. There's not a single senior executive team or board of directors that wants to land on the front of the Wall Street Journal. So they're trying to be careful, but I think it's harder now than it used to be.
What you wanted to say?
You mentioned harm to consumers, and it is true that the 2 million fake accounts where some $5 million in fees were erroneously charged is serious. FICO scores might change, or the credit worthiness of some of these people who fail to service their account because they didn't know it. But Wells Fargo is in pretty much every index fund. And the average American who owns stock probably owns an index fund, and he probably or she probably owns Wells Fargo. Once we, the investment community, learned that Wells Fargo was making its numbers, and we were looking carefully at that cross-sell, and for 17 years in a row it broke a record, better than Bernie Madoff could have done, and we found out on September 8th that they were faking it. The stock was devalued by $20 billion, and I'll do the quick math. $20 billion is a lot more than $5 million, and we suffered that. We are now, those of us who own Wells Fargo stock, and I do, and parenthetically I filed a shareholder resolution to break up the bank precisely because it is too big to manage. They can't, either the senior management concocted this crime or failed to stop it. One way or the other, something's got to change. But that's the most serious harm to consumers is those who are investors just had roughly 10% of their value wiped out.
Okay, we are going to take a break right now. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Well, welcome back. We're talking about the question of corporate corruption in the United States. Let's get back to our panel. And Bart, you were talking a moment ago about the impact on consumers here in the United States. What about the impact internationally? I mean, there are many companies outside the United States, many individuals outside the United States that invest in companies here on the stock exchange here. They're affected as well.
Sure. Anybody that owns Wells Fargo stock was affected. I mentioned American investors. The largest investor in Citi, I think, is somebody from the Middle East. The fact that we are an American nation of American banks is really a false premise because this is a global market where we actually don't know who the investors are. Most investors, as we know, are so-called beneficial holders. So I own through Schwab. Wells Fargo doesn't even know I'm an investor, and Wells Fargo doesn't know who their investors are if they are beneficial holding through a third party.
Right. Yeah. Richard, let's look at some of what's being done in the United States to counter this. I mean, we have congressional hearings. We saw a bit of that in our report at the beginning of the show where we had Elizabeth Warren, a Democrat senator, questioning the chief of Wells Fargo. And I'm just wondering, to what extent is this theatrics that we are seeing in Congress? I mean, is there anything that comes out of these hearings?
Well, I think when you pull the curtain back, I mean, we have the sort of political pressure that we talked about before. That's certainly well exemplified by those Senate banking hearings. But if we look at, again, some recent changes at the Justice Department, they recently brought in a compliance counsel. So this is someone who rose up through the Department of Justice, but she also had a few chapters of her career as a compliance executive working for large multinationals. Because the compliance department in a multinational, whether it be Wells Fargo or Mylan, they're supposed to be the gatekeepers of legal, ethical, and compliant behavior, and they're supposed to have a line of sight into the business. Whether it be incentive strategies, business practices, they're supposed to see what's going on. And the Justice Department hired someone to look at those systems, to analyze the culture of compliance, and to see if these multinationals are really embracing a culture of compliance in terms of an ethical workforce.
Yeah, and the reason I asked that question is because if we look at what happened in Congress there, we had the chief of Wells Fargo, as I pointed out. I mean, he lost his job, he was humiliated, but he still walked off a very rich man and free.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, the idea that he walked off a very rich man, I think it's very poor consolation. I don't think any CEO, I think any CEO would gladly give up tens of millions of dollars to not be drummed out of their company the way Chairman CEO Stumpf was. You know, the idea that these companies are going to be somehow driven to better behavior by legislation, I think is kind of a fool's errand. I mean, when your company's stock price drops 10 to 20%, that's all that the senior executive team or the board or the investors need to hear before they begin implementing changes. And they're in a position best to implement the changes that need to be made. A lot of laws that are passed on top of that are generally just piling on. They're designed to stop bad people from doing things, and most of these scandals that we're seeing are not necessarily bad people doing things. It's good people getting trapped in perverse incentives, doing bad things.
Richard, if we look at the case of EpiPen, we talked about that earlier on, and we just, let's look at the pricing here. You know, here we had a product, a life-saving product, where the price was increased 600%, as we pointed out. It was selling here in the United States for something like $600. Yet that very same product sells in the United Kingdom for around $100. I mean, how does one explain a price discrepancy like that?
Well, I don't know that you can. And Mylan recently paid almost $500 million in a settlement with the Department of Justice because they're charging the government for many of these products. So I think that's a case, again, where you look at the executive compensation structure, where apparently there was an incentive plan to double earnings over a 5-year period, and if management didn't achieve 90% of that goal, there would be nothing paid. So it was a win big, lose big bonus plan, and look at the unintended consequences. And again, you had some bad behavior being hidden behind good performance, and look at what happened.
Mark, we've been hearing a lot during this election campaign about corporate malfeasance. We heard Donald Trump accuse Hillary Clinton of malfeasance by making these speeches to Wall Street companies behind closed doors, for which he received hundreds of thousands of dollars. We've got the election coming up in 2 weeks. After that, do you think, in the new, whomever becomes president, do you think that's going to change?
At the end of the day, the law is really effective. And I take issue with what Bart says. I don't believe that it's because the government doesn't want to enforce these things. I think that almost borders on like a reverse conspiracy theory. I think it's because the problems are much more difficult than the laws can really address.
But do we see these kind of corporate scandals in other parts of the world?
I have so much trouble keeping up with U.S. scandals that I can't actually tell you that Iceland is worse. Iceland, by the way, jailed 76 of its bankers. It's one of the few countries to respond in what I think is the appropriate way. Deutsche Bank is riven with problems. They've already begun to, in the final stages of settling the mortgage securitization, much of which took place in the United States. But their trading desk runs wild, I'm told, with prop trading. The company is worth extraordinarily little. I don't think Americans have a monopoly on greed. I think it's correct that some of our incentives have gone off the rails. We are far more in love with stock options, apparently, than the Japanese or many European firms. Highly inappropriate for banks, which should be more risk averse than, let's say, an entrepreneurial firm. I mean, healthcare is an entirely different level. In one sense, you would argue it's a public good. So where we see a public-facing and public good-producing company colliding with bad incentives, I think, is where the scandals are most intense.
Okay, and we're going to have to end it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CCTV_America. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.